Black Friday. Just the name used to send a chill down my spine, but not for the reasons you'd expect. I never really cared for the chaos. Mobs of people trampling each other for discounted TVs, the shouting, the arguments over the last blender on the shelf. But that year, my girlfriend, Emily, begged me to come along. "It's tradition," she said, flashing her most persuasive smile. "And besides, it's fun. Like a treasure hunt." I wasn't convinced, but I loved her, and saying no felt like an uphill battle. She promised we'd be in and out before the madness got too bad. The plan was simple: hit the midnight sale at Harper's Megamart, grab a few things, and leave. We pulled into the parking lot just before midnight. It was packed. Cars spilled onto the streets, their headlights cutting through the cold November air. People huddled in lines that snaked around the building, their breath visible in the frosty glow of the streetlights. The air buzzed with restless energy, the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I told you this was a bad idea," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel. Emily rolled her eyes. "Relax. It's just a sale." But as we got out of the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The crowd didn't look like they were just waiting for a sale. They were tense, almost anxious, like animals sensing a storm. A man near the entrance caught my eye. He was older, with a scruffy beard and a ratty coat. He wasn't in line. He just stood there, staring at the doors, muttering something under his breath. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, pulling me toward the line. "Yeah," I said, shaking it off. "Let's just get this over with." The doors opened at midnight sharp. The crowd surged forward, a wave of bodies shoving and shouting as they flooded into the store. I held on to Emily's hand, trying not to get separated as we were swept inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and Christmas music played faintly over the speakers, barely audible over the chaos. We headed straight for the electronics section. Emily wanted a new laptop, and Harper's was advertising a deal that was too good to pass up. The aisle was a war zone, people shoving, grabbing, yelling. A man lunged for the last box on a shelf, only to have it yanked out of his hands by a woman with a crazed look in her eyes. "This is insane," I said, but Emily was already diving into the fray. I stayed back, watching the madness unfold. That's when I noticed him again, the man from outside. He wasn't shopping. He stood at the edge of the aisle, his eyes darting around as if searching for something, or someone. "Sir, do you need help?" I asked, stepping closer. He looked at me, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They're watching." "Who's watching?" Before he could answer, a loud crash came from the next aisle. I turned, my heart racing. When I looked back, the man was gone. I found Emily a few minutes later, triumphantly clutching a laptop box. "Got it," she said, grinning. "Now let's check out and go home." The lines at the registers were insane, stretching back into the aisles. We queued up, surrounded by the hum of impatient voices and the sharp beeps of barcode scanners. Emily scrolled through her phone, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man's words. "You shouldn't be here. They're watching." I glanced around the store. The chaos seemed normal enough, parents bickering, kids crying, shoppers arguing over discounts. But then I noticed something strange. A group of people stood near the back wall, away from the crowds. They weren't shopping. They weren't even moving. They just stood there, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Emily, nodding toward the group. She followed my gaze. "See what?" "Those people. Over there." She squinted, then frowned. "There's no one there, Jason. Are you okay?" I blinked, my stomach twisting. The group was still there, but Emily didn't seem to notice them. Maybe it was the stress, the lights, the noise. Maybe I was just imagining things. We finally made it to the register and checked out. As we left the store, I glanced over my shoulder. The group was gone, but something else caught my eye. The older man from earlier stood at the edge of the parking lot, watching us. When our eyes met, he mouthed a single word. "Run." Outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap. The parking lot was still a madhouse, cars honking and people yelling as they loaded their loot. Emily unlocked the car, but I hesitated, glancing back at the store. The front doors gleamed under the floodlights, but something about them looked wrong. Like the reflections were moving when they shouldn't be. "Jason, come on," Emily called, snapping me out of it. I climbed into the car, but the unease stayed with me. As we pulled out of the lot, I caught one last glimpse of the store in the rearview mirror. The lights inside flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw shadows moving, long, twisted shapes that didn't belong to the shoppers. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, faint whispers and the occasional scrape of metal against concrete. At one point, I got up and checked the locks, peering out the window into the dark street. Nothing. Just the wind rustling through the trees. I crawled back into bed, telling myself I was overreacting. But as I drifted off, I thought I heard something faint in the distance. Bells. Not Christmas bells. Something heavier, deeper, like chains rattling. The next morning, I woke to find Emily gone. The bed next to me was cold, the blankets neatly folded. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from her. Went back to Harper's to grab a few more deals. Be back soon. Love you? My stomach dropped. After everything I'd seen, the last thing I wanted was for her to go back there. I called her, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried to convince myself it was fine. She was probably caught up in the shopping chaos again, phone buried at the bottom of her purse. But something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the image of those people standing motionless by the wall, the old man's warning, the flickering shadows in the store. And the sound of those bells last night. They weren't a dream. I had heard them, faint and distant, but real. By 11 a.m., when Emily still hadn't come home, I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my keys and drove back to Harper's. The parking lot was just as packed as the night before, but now there was a strange quietness to it. Shoppers moved between cars, but no one seemed to be talking. Their faces were blank, their movements slow and mechanical. I parked and made my way inside, weaving through the crowd. The store felt darker, colder, as if the fluorescent lights were dimmer than they should be. The Christmas music that had played nonstop yesterday was gone, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the occasional beep of a register. "Emily!" I called, but no one turned to look at me. Shoppers shuffled past, their eyes fixed on the shelves, as though they couldn't hear me. The deeper I went into the store, the stranger it became. Displays were overturned, and carts lay abandoned in the aisles. I passed the electronics section, where I'd found Emily last night. The shelves were picked clean, but no one was shopping there now. The space felt wrong. Like the air was heavier, harder to breathe. And then I saw it. Near the back wall, where the group of motionless people had stood the night before, something dark was smeared across the tiles. It looked like a trail of soot, leading from the wall to the storage room door. The door itself was slightly ajar, and faint sounds came from inside, a low, rhythmic jingling, like the bells I'd heard the night before. I shouldn't have gone in. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave and call the police. But I couldn't. Emily was somewhere in this store, and I wasn't leaving without her. I pushed the door open and stepped into the storage room. The air was freezing, and the light from my phone barely penetrated the darkness. The trail of soot continued across the floor, leading to a row of shelves filled with unopened boxes. Beyond them, I could hear the jingling more clearly now, accompanied by the faint sound of chains dragging across concrete. "Emily?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I moved slowly, my breath visible in the frigid air. The shelves cast long shadows, and the sound of the chains grew louder with every step. Then I saw it, a figure crouched in the corner, its back to me. It was massive, its shoulders hunched, and something writhed in the sack it held in its clawed hands. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure stopped. Slowly, it turned its head, and my blood turned to ice. Its face was obscured by a twisted mask of bone, and its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. It stood, towering over me, its horns scraping the ceiling. The sack it carried fell to the ground with a wet thud, and from inside I heard muffled cries. My legs refused to move as the creature stepped toward me, the chains draped across its shoulders clinking with every step. "You shouldn't have come back," it growled, its voice deep and guttural. I stumbled backward, tripping over a box. The creature lunged, and I scrambled to my feet, running blindly through the shelves. The jingling bells followed me, along with the sound of heavy footsteps and dragging chains. I burst out of the storage room and into the main store, my heart hammering. The shoppers were still there, moving in slow, mindless patterns, their eyes empty. I screamed for help, but none of them reacted. It was like they didn't even see me. The bells grew louder, and I turned to see the creature emerge from the storage room, its horns casting jagged shadows across the floor. It raised a clawed hand, pointing directly at me. "Emily!" I shouted, desperate, my voice echoing through the store. And then I saw her. She was standing near the registers, clutching her shopping bags, her face blank like the others. I ran to her, grabbing her shoulders. "Emily, we have to go! Now!" She blinked, her expression distant, as if she didn't recognize me. "Jason?" she said finally, her voice flat. I have to finish shopping." "No, you don't!" I shouted, shaking her. "We have to leave!" Behind me, the creature let out a deafening roar. Emily's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed to snap out of it. "Jason, what is that?" she whispered. "Run!" I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the exit. The creature's chains whipped through the air, crashing into a display behind us. We weaved through the aisles, the sound of the jingling bells growing closer. We reached the exit, bursting into the cold air of the parking lot. The shoppers inside didn't follow. They just stood there, watching us from behind the glass, their faces emotionless. The creature stopped at the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It couldn't, or wouldn't, step outside. Instead, it raised its clawed hand and pointed at me again. "You can't escape," it growled. "Not forever." And then it was gone, the doors slamming shut behind it. The shoppers inside turned back to their carts, moving as if nothing had happened. Emily and I never spoke about what happened. We drove home in silence, leaving everything we'd bought behind. For weeks, I had nightmares about the creature, about its glowing eyes and the sound of those bells. I deleted every photo I'd taken in Harper's, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the jingling again, faint and distant. And when I do, I lock the doors and pray that it doesn't come back. Black Friday wasn't my thing. I never understood the appeal of battling crowds just to save a few bucks. But that year, things were different. I was strapped for cash after losing my job, and Christmas was around the corner. My little brother, Timmy, had his heart set on a gaming console, and Harper's Superstore was offering the best deal in town. 50% off, but only for the first 50 customers. It was almost midnight when I pulled into the parking lot. The store looked like a war zone, with a line of people stretching around the building, their breath fogging in the cold November air. Some had tents, others clutched steaming thermoses of coffee, and a few were already bickering over their spots in line. The store lights glowed ominously in the distance, the giant banner reading, "Black Friday Mega Sale! Midnight Madness!" I found a spot near the back of the lot, grabbed my coat, and joined the line. I was far from the first 50, but I figured I'd still get something decent. The line shuffled forward slowly, and the tension was palpable. People weren't talking, just staring at the glass doors as if they were waiting for something. At exactly midnight, the doors slid open, and the crowd surged forward like a dam breaking. I was nearly knocked off my feet as people shoved past me, screaming and scrambling for carts. The employees stood by, their smiles frozen and hollow, like they had seen this madness too many times before. The store was chaos. Shoppers tore through aisles like wild animals, grabbing anything they could get their hands on. A woman shoved past me, clutching a toaster like her life depended on it. A man screamed at someone for taking the last TV off the shelf. But it wasn't just the usual Black Friday insanity. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong. The lights flickered faintly overhead, casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch too far. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was harder to breathe the deeper I went into the store. I finally made it to the electronics section, which looked like a battlefield. Shelves were nearly empty, and customers were ripping open boxes, tossing aside what they didn't want. I spotted the gaming console Timmy wanted, one lonely box sitting on the bottom shelf. I made a beeline for it, but as I reached down to grab it, another hand shot out, gripping it tight. "Hey!" I shouted, turning to face my competition. It was a man, probably in his 40s, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes. He stared at me, unblinking, his grip on the box unnervingly strong. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but instead, he just smiled, a crooked, unsettling smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You want it that bad?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound confident. "It's for my little brother." The man tilted his head, his smile widening. "Then you'd better leave. This place isn't safe." Before I could respond, he let go of the box and disappeared into the crowd. I stood there for a moment, shaken, but I chalked it up to another Black Friday lunatic. I grabbed the console and headed for the checkout. The line to pay was a nightmare. I stood there for what felt like hours, the chaos around me growing stranger by the minute. The crowd seemed to thin out, but not because people were leaving. Shoppers wandered aimlessly, their faces blank, their eyes glassy. One woman stood in the middle of the aisle, holding a blender and staring at nothing. I glanced at my phone. 1:17 a.m. I should have been home by now, but the line hadn't moved in ages. I looked around for an employee but couldn't see any. It was like they had all vanished. The store felt colder. The lights above flickered again, longer this time, plunging the aisles into brief, suffocating darkness. When the lights came back, I noticed something I hadn't before. The mirrors near the registers. They were cracked, every single one of them, as if something had struck them with incredible force. I hadn't heard anything break, but there they were, spiderwebbed with fractures. I turned to the man in line behind me. "Did you see?" But he wasn't there. No one was. The line I'd been standing in was gone, the carts abandoned. My stomach twisted as I looked around. The store was almost empty now, but I hadn't seen anyone leave. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. No answer. The air felt heavier, colder, and the flickering lights buzzed louder. I started walking toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. As I passed the aisles, I noticed more signs of chaos. Shelves were overturned, products scattered everywhere. One aisle was completely dark, and I could hear faint scratching sounds coming from the shadows. I didn't look. I just kept moving. When I reached the front doors, they didn't open. I waved my hand in front of the sensor, but nothing happened. The glass was fogged over, making it impossible to see outside. I pounded on the doors, shouting for someone to let me out, but the sound seemed to die before it reached the other side. Then I heard it. Bells. Faint at first, jingling softly, but growing louder with every second. They weren't cheerful, like Christmas bells. They were deep, heavy, and discordant, clanging out of sync. My heart pounded as the sound filled the store, echoing off the walls. I turned, and that's when I saw him. A figure stood at the end of the aisle, shrouded in shadows. He was tall, unnaturally tall, with broad shoulders and a head that brushed the flickering lights above. His face was obscured, but his eyes glowed faintly in the dark, two pinpricks of malevolent light. He held something in his hand. A bell. It was old, rusted, and massive, and he swung it slowly, the sound reverberating through the air like a death knell. I backed away, my hands shaking, clutching the gaming console like it was a lifeline. The figure didn't move, but I felt his gaze boring into me, cold and unrelenting. Then he raised his other hand, long and clawed, and pointed directly at me. I froze, my heart pounding as the figure pointed at me, his glowing eyes locked onto mine. The bell in his hand swung again, the sound heavy and slow, echoing through the empty store. The air around me felt dense, suffocating, like it was pressing down on my chest. I clutched the gaming console tighter, my mind screaming at me to move, but my legs refused. The figure started to step forward, his movements unnaturally slow yet deliberate, like he was savoring every second of my fear. His silhouette loomed larger with every step, and the faint jingling of chains joined the sound of the bell. Finally, my body listened. I turned and bolted down the nearest aisle, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The shelves around me blurred as I ran, the flickering lights casting distorted shadows on the walls. Behind me, the bell rang again, louder and closer, as though it was chasing me. I rounded a corner and skidded to a stop. The aisle ahead was blocked, shelves overturned, boxes and products scattered everywhere. I spun around, searching for another way out, but the figure was there, standing at the end of the aisle, his glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "Leave the game," a deep, guttural voice echoed, though his mouth didn't move. The sound reverberated through the store, shaking the shelves. "It isn't worth your soul." I didn't stop to think. I grabbed a can of soup from the floor and hurled it at him. It hit his chest with a dull thud and rolled to the ground. He didn't flinch, didn't react, just raised his bell and swung it again. The sound rippled through me, and I stumbled back, my vision blurring for a moment as the air around me seemed to pulse. I turned and ran, climbing over the debris blocking the aisle. My hands slipped on a box of cereal, and I nearly fell, but adrenaline kept me moving. The bell clanged behind me, and I swore I could feel the vibrations rattling through my bones. I reached the electronics section again, the gaming console still in my hands. Why I hadn't dropped it, I couldn't say. Maybe it was the promise I'd made to Timmy, or maybe some stubborn part of me thought letting go would make things worse. The shelves in this section were mostly intact, and I ducked behind one, trying to catch my breath. My hands shook as I clutched the console to my chest, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The store was silent now, the bell and chains gone. I almost thought I'd lost him. Then I heard the whisper. "You can't hide." The voice was soft but guttural, as if it were scraping against the walls of my mind. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying not to scream. The lights overhead flickered violently, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Something moved behind the shelves, slow and deliberate. I peeked through a gap between the boxes and saw him again, his clawed hand dragging along the metal, leaving long, jagged scratches. His bell was silent now, but the faint jingling of chains followed him like a ghostly echo. I had to get out of there. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I crawled to the end of the shelf and bolted for the exit. The glass doors loomed ahead, their surface fogged over, but I didn't care. I slammed into them with all my weight, but they didn't budge. "Open, damn it!" I shouted, pounding on the glass. The reflection in the door shifted. At first I thought it was my own, panicked, desperate. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It wasn't me. It was him. His glowing eyes stared back at me through the glass, his form distorted but unmistakable. He was closer now, standing just behind me. Slowly I turned, and there he was, his massive frame towering over me. His bell hung motionless in his hand, but the air around it seemed to shimmer, like heat rising off pavement. "Leave the game." The voice boomed again, louder this time, shaking the floor beneath me. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. I thought of Timmy, of how much he wanted this stupid console, and the promise I'd made to make him happy. "I can't," I whispered, barely able to speak. The creature tilted his head, as if studying me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something human behind those glowing eyes. Then he raised his clawed hand, and the bell began to swing again. The sound hit me like a tidal wave, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the parking lot, the cold asphalt biting into my skin. The store was dark, its lights off, and the parking lot was empty. My car was still there, and the gaming console was sitting on the ground beside me, untouched. I stumbled to my feet, clutching the console, and climbed into my car. My hand shook as I fumbled with the keys, but the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I sped out of the lot, the store disappearing into the night. I made it home just before sunrise. Timmy was waiting for me, his eyes lighting up when he saw the box. "You got it," he said, hugging me tight. I forced a smile and handed it to him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air in my apartment felt colder, heavier, and I swore I could hear faint jingling somewhere in the distance. That night, I dreamed of the store. The aisles were dark, the shelves empty, and the bell rang over and over, louder with each swing. When I woke, I found a small, rusted bell sitting on my nightstand. It wasn't mine, and the sound of chains dragging echoed faintly from the hallway. Black Friday was always a spectacle, something I watched from the comfort of my couch with leftover turkey and a beer. Crowds fighting over flat-screen TVs? No thanks. But this year, things were different. My old TV had finally died, and the thought of watching Sunday football on a flickering screen was unbearable. Harper's Electronics Superstore had the perfect deal, a 60-inch 4K smart TV for half price. The catch? Only the first 20 customers got the discount. Against my better judgment, I found myself sitting in my car in the Harper's parking lot at 11:15 p.m., clutching a thermos of coffee and wearing my warmest coat. The line outside the store was already snaking halfway around the building. People huddled together, their breath fogging the freezing air, clutching folding chairs and blankets. It wasn't just a shopping trip, it was war. I joined the line and tried to blend in. The guy ahead of me wore a tattered leather jacket and kept muttering to himself. A woman 2 spots ahead shouted at someone trying to cut in line, waving her gloved fists like she was ready to fight. It all felt tense. Too tense. "Crazy night, huh?" I said to the guy in the jacket, hoping to make small talk. He didn't look at me. "They always come out on Black Friday," he muttered. "Who?" He turned slightly, his face pale and gaunt, like he hadn't slept in days. "You'll see." The doors opened at midnight, and chaos erupted. The line dissolved into a stampede as people rushed the entrance. I was shoved forward, nearly losing my footing as we flooded into the store. Bright fluorescent lights illuminated rows of stacked TVs, shelves of laptops, and pallets of discounted gadgets. The air buzzed with the frantic energy of hundreds of shoppers all vying for the best deals. I made a beeline for the TV section, weaving through the crowd like a running back. The stack of 60-inch TVs was already dwindling, and a small crowd was forming around it. People shouted, grabbed, and shoved, clawing at the boxes like their lives depended on it. I spotted one near the bottom of the stack and reached for it just as another hand shot out. It was a woman, her face twisted in anger. "I saw it first," she yelled, yanking on the box. "It's mine!" I shouted back, refusing to let go. The box teetered dangerously, and for a moment, I thought the entire stack might collapse. Then she stopped, her eyes darting past me, her expression shifting from anger to fear. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "What?" I asked, turning to look. But there was nothing there. Just the usual chaos of Black Friday, the shouting, the scrambling, the endless buzz of fluorescent lights. When I turned back, she was gone. The box was still in my hands, and I didn't waste another second. I hoisted it up and made my way toward the checkout. That's when I noticed the mirrors. The store had large, circular security mirrors mounted at the ends of the aisles, reflecting the madness below. But something was off. The reflections didn't match what was happening around me. People in the mirrors moved slower, their faces distorted. One man's reflection seemed to stare at me, even though he was facing away. I stopped and stared at one of the mirrors, trying to figure out what was wrong. My own reflection seemed delayed, moving a fraction of a second after I did. And then, for just a moment, I saw something else, something that wasn't there. A dark shape, tall and thin, standing at the far end of the aisle, its head tilted unnaturally. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just the exhaustion or the adrenaline messing with my head. But as I pushed the TV toward the checkout line, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The line for the registers was impossibly long, stretching back into the store. I parked my cart and settled in for the wait, my heart still racing. The woman ahead of me turned and smiled. "Crazy night, huh?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a laugh. "You could say that." She nodded toward the security mirrors. "You see them too, don't you?" My mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The shadows. They only come out on nights like this, when the greed is strongest." I stared at her, unsure if she was messing with me or if she actually believed what she was saying. Before I could respond, the lights above flickered. The store fell silent for a moment, the buzz of conversation replaced by a low hum. When the lights came back, the woman was gone. I scanned the crowd, but she wasn't anywhere. Her cart was still there, empty, as if she'd never existed. The people around me didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. They just shuffled forward in line, their faces blank and tired. That's when I heard it. A faint, scraping sound, like metal dragging across the floor. It came from somewhere deep in the store, growing louder with each passing second. I turned, peering down the aisles, but I couldn't see anything. The scraping stopped. Then came a voice, low and guttural, echoing faintly through the store. "Mine!" I gripped the handle of my cart, my knuckles white. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No one answered. The other shoppers didn't even look up, as if they couldn't hear it. I felt a cold draft, like someone had opened a door to the winter night, but the entrance was far away. Then I saw it again, reflected in the security mirror. The dark shape, taller than a man, its limbs impossibly long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It stood at the edge of the aisle, unmoving, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short gasps. I needed to leave, now. "Keep it," the voice growled, closer this time. I turned back toward the register, but the line was gone. The shoppers, the carts, the noise, it had all vanished. The store was silent, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I stood there, alone, clutching the handle of my cart. And then the lights went out. The lights flickered back on after what felt like an eternity, but the store was still deathly quiet. The rows of products seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. The TV in my cart felt heavier than before, its weight pressing against my chest as I gripped the handle. My breath echoed in the silence, too loud, like I didn't belong in this space anymore. I turned the cart, aiming for the exit, but it wasn't there. The doors were gone, replaced by a blank wall. My pulse quickened as I looked around. The store seemed different. The aisles were taller, the shelves looming above me like walls in a labyrinth. Shadows pooled in the corners, unnaturally thick, like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Not even an echo. I pushed the cart forward, the wheels squeaking in protest. The faint sound of jingling bells drifted through the air, soft at first, but growing louder with every step. They didn't sound like cheerful Christmas bells. They were slow, deliberate, like something was dragging them through the aisles. I stopped, my hands tightening on the cart. "Who's there?" The bells stopped. I turned a corner, and there it was, the dark shape from the mirrors. It stood at the far end of the aisle, impossibly tall, its body thin and twisted. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it was trying to decide what to do with me. The shadows around it moved, writhing like living things. The TV in my car tipped slightly, and the noise snapped me out of my frozen state. I backed away, my breath quick and shallow, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Then the lights flickered again, and it was gone. I ran. Abandoning the cart, I sprinted down the aisles, my footsteps echoing off the tile floor. The shelves seemed to stretch and twist, leading me in circles. Every turn looked the same: more aisles, more shelves, the same fluorescent lights flickering above. The jingling bells started again, louder this time, accompanied by the faint scraping of metal. I turned another corner and stopped dead in my tracks. It was closer now. The creature crouched low, its limbs too long for its body, its head cocked to the side. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, two pinpricks of yellow light that seemed to pierce through me. "Leave," it said, its voice guttural and layered, like multiple people speaking at once. "You don't belong here." I stumbled backward, my hands groping for something, anything, to defend myself. My fingers closed around a heavy box on the shelf, and I hurled it at the creature. It didn't flinch. The box hit the ground with a thud, and the sound echoed unnaturally, like it was being swallowed by the air itself. The creature rose to its full height, its head brushing the ceiling. Its shadow stretched toward me, crawling across the floor like it had a life of its own. Then it lunged. I ran again, faster this time, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The shelves around me blurred as I sprinted, the bells and scraping metal growing louder with every step. I turned corner after corner, desperately searching for the exit, but there was nothing, just more aisles, more shelves, and the oppressive flickering lights. Finally I saw it, a red glow at the end of the aisle. It wasn't the exit, but it was something. I bolted toward it, my legs burning, the air freezing in my lungs. The glow grew brighter, and I realized it was coming from a door, a fire exit, its red light casting long shadows across the floor. I threw myself at the door, slamming into it with all my weight. It didn't budge. I pounded on it, screaming, but the handle wouldn't turn. Behind me, the bells stopped. Slowly I turned. The creature stood at the other end of the aisle, its body hunched, its glowing eyes fixed on me. In its clawed hand, it held a chain, the metal links dragging across the floor as it moved. The air around it seemed to ripple, like heat rising off asphalt. "Leave," it said again, its voice vibrating through my chest. "This place isn't yours." I grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it as hard as I could. The creature recoiled slightly, hissing as the extinguisher connected with its arm. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran, ducking between shelves, my mind racing for a way out. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into the electronics section again. The TV I'd abandoned earlier was still there, sitting in the middle of the aisle. But something was wrong. The screen was on, flickering with static, though it wasn't plugged in. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The static cleared for a moment, and I saw an image, a man standing in an empty aisle, clutching a cart, his face pale and terrified. It was me. The static returned, and the TV went dark. A cold wind blew through the aisle, and I felt a presence behind me. Slowly I turned. The creature loomed over me, its chains coiled like a serpent. Its glowing eyes burned brighter, and its clawed hand reached for my chest. "You took what isn't yours," it said, its voice low and resonant. "Now you pay the price." I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, I was lying in the parking lot, the cold asphalt biting into my skin. The store was dark, its windows shattered, the parking lot empty except for my car. In my hands was the TV, still in its box. I drove home in silence, my mind racing. When I got inside, I set the box down and stared at it for a long time. I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. The next morning, I set it up in the living room. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment, I saw my reflection. It stared back at me, its expression blank and hollow, before the screen went dark. Every night since, I've heard the bells. Faint at first, but growing louder. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I swear I see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows.